Bright Duty. Every student matters.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the class. So today we have chapter 15. Now in this chapter we'll look at China and Japan, which are two countries in East Asia. Okay, so the title of this chapter where we look at East Asia and two important countries from East Asia, that title given to the chapter is called Paths to Modernization. So we'll look at China and Japan, and how these two countries took the path of modernizing their respective countries. Okay, and the period during which this happened, the period of China and Japan that we are going to see and we are going to learn about is the late 19th and 20th century. Okay, so the history of Japan and China and how it adopted modernization, so that we are going to look by looking at the years from late 19th and 20th century. Okay. Now, in the beginning of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 1800s, China was a dominant power in East Asia. And Japan was a small country and it was isolated. Okay, so in the beginning of the 19th century, Japan was not powerful. It was a small island country and it was quite isolated. It was quite separated. Okay, but China was a dominant power in East Asia. Okay, in the eastern part of Asia. All right. But within a few decades, within a couple of decades, China became prey to exploitation, to imperialism, and imperialist attempts of colonial powers of Europe, the power of China, which it exercised in the beginning of the 19th century, that did not last long because China became prey. China was exploited. China was also attacked and also brought under the influence of European powers. Okay. The imperialist government of China lost control over the people and failed to introduce reforms effectively. So the government in China lost its power and control over the people and hence could not govern the country with its people properly. Okay, and the country, as a result of its weaknesses, internal weaknesses, it was engaged in a civil war. It was engaged with a lot of conflicts between rival parties, between different groups within China. Now, that was the development of China towards the beginning of the 19th century. Now, what was happening to Japan? Now, Japan, on the other hand, did not experience similar things as China. Japan developed into a modern nation state, It established an industrial economy. So, its economic power was growing. It grew. All right, while China fell prey to exploitation of the imperialist and colonial powers of Europe. All right. And Japan, as they became powerful economically, it succeeded in establishing a colonial empire. It became successful in colonizing Taiwan in 1895 and Korea in 1910. So, a small island country which was isolated by the early 19th century, that island country became so powerful that it colonized Taiwan and Korea. It also defeated China in 1894 in the first Sino-Japanese War. In the first war fought between China and Japan, Japan became victorious, and as a result of it, it exercised influence and power over China. It also defeated Russia in a war that was fought between Russia and Japan in the year 1905. So, by the beginning of the 20th century, Japan had turned out to be one of the most powerful countries in the world. Okay? Now, the Chinese, after experiencing numerous difficulties, after facing numerous difficulties, they began to react. They began to find solutions. They began to work in order to overcome or fight those difficulties. Okay, so finally, Chinese Communist Party came out victorious in this struggle, the struggle to have control and influence over China and its people, and it brought the Communist Party brought communist revolution in the October of 1949. Okay. Now this Communist Party formed the communist government, and that government was able to bring changes, huge changes in the economy of the country. Okay, so by the end of the 1970s, the communist leaders realized that their ideological system was retarding economic growth and development. But this Communist Party's government and their economic policy was not helping China towards the end of the 1970s. Okay, and they began to realize that the economy of the country was still declining. The development was still declining. Okay, so the reforms, they brought out reforms, and that reforms brought back capitalism and free market economy, though the Communist Party retained political control. So the Communist Party retained political control over China, but they introduced reforms which brought back capitalism and free market economy. Okay, it was different from how its policies were in the 1940s, late 1940s and 50s, 60s. All right. Now, Japan also built modernization on capitalist principles. Japan was also developing its economy through capitalist principles. Okay, and Japan's rapid development underlined the strength of the traditions of Japanese institutions and society, their ability to learn, and the strength of nationalism. So the kind of rapid economic development and growth that Japan experienced, that Japan witnessed, and it demonstrated to the world, to other countries, that showed the Japanese institutions, that showed the traditions, the strength of the traditions of the Japanese society, culture, and the Japanese ability to learn, Japanese ability to overcome difficulties, and their strength of nationalism. Okay, so all these aspects of development, of growth in each of these respective countries, in China as well as Japan, helped to develop both of them as a modern nation state. So this particular chapter will help us understand, will tell us how Japan in one case and China in another case went through series of events, okay, over the two centuries, 19th and 20th centuries, to come out as a powerful modern nation state. Okay, so the first country that we are going to look at is that of Japan. In the 16th century, some European merchants and Christian missionaries, they reached Japan. Okay, but in the 17th century, the opposition of the Buddhist, okay, because of the opposition of the Buddhist priests, the missionaries who were coming to Japan or who had entered Japan were no longer allowed to enter Japan. The missionaries, the travelers, the traders coming from foreign countries, they were all turned back. Okay. Now, after that, for over 2 centuries, from 1638 AD to 1853 AD, Japan was practically closed and cut off from Europe and Europe from Japan. Okay, so basically earlier Japan allowed foreigners to enter into its country. But after after the 17th century, for almost 2 centuries, for almost 200 years, Japan completely shut itself from the outside world. Excuse me. It did not allow any entry to the foreign travelers, missionaries, foreign merchants into Japan. And Japanese could also not go out to the foreign lands. It was completely cut off from Europe, and Europe was completely cut off from Japan. Okay? In the middle of the 19th century, the US government sent a fleet of ships to Japan under the command of Commodore Perry. He made a commercial treaty with the government of Japan. The treaty paved the way for signing of such treaties by Japan with Holland, Russia, Britain, and France. But so just now we learned how Japan was cut off from the outside world, from foreign countries. But this changed in the middle of the 19th century because then it began to open its doors to the foreign countries. Now, this started with a treaty which was signed between Japan and the US, United States government, and with this after the treaty after this treaty, the doors were opened to other countries as well. So now Japan allowed entry not only to US, not only to America, United States of America, but also Holland, Russia, Britain, and France. Okay. Now, after Japan opened itself to the foreign countries, what happened to Japan? Okay, so let us see. Now, the opening of Japan gave rise to the spread of anti-foreign sentiments. Okay, so as Japan opened its doors to the foreign countries, it gave rise to spread of anti-foreign sentiments. Okay, now people spread anti-foreign sentiments. All right, they were against the foreigners. So those sentiments and feelings against the foreigners was spread. All right. The real power of the government lay with the shoguns or big landlords, and the emperor was only a nominal head. During that time, the government rested, the rule of Japan rested on the hands of shoguns or big landlords. Shoguns were basically big landlords, and the emperor, who was the emperor of Japan, was just a nominal head. Okay, he was not as powerful as he was expected to be. The country was divided into 250 domains under the lords called daimyo. Okay, so the country was divided into 250 small domains, and each domain was led by or headed by a daimyo. The people demanded abolition of this shogunate system of the rule of the governance of Japan and its people by the shoguns. People were against it. Okay, in 1867 AD, the last shogun resigned as a result of protest from the people. The king ordered the office of shogun to be abolished, and the king removed the office of shogun. All the powers were now transferred to the emperor of Japan from the shogunate, from the shoguns. Okay, so emperor became powerful. All right, all the powers now rested or were transferred from big landlords or shoguns to the emperor. All right. Another important result of or outcome of Japan's opening of Japan was that with the opening of Japan, there was a beginning of modernization that took place in Japan. Okay, the emperor Mikado Manchihito, who was also called Meiji, became the ruler of Japan, and he brought out this movement of modernizing Japan. Okay, the movement to modernize Japan. So he ruled from 1867 to 1912. Okay, and during his reign, a movement to modernize Japan took place, and that was called Meiji Restoration, which we'll look at in detail a little later. So he started, Meiji or Mikado Manchihito started a hurricane of economic reforms and westernization of his country. So he began to introduce economic reforms, changes to westernize his country, to modernize his country. Okay? So we already know that in the mid 19th century, a great change occurred in Japan, and that was the government of the shoguns, the government which was led by or headed by the shoguns, that came to an end. So the shogunate period came to an end. Okay, the emperor now provided a rallying point for the nation against foreign menace. Okay. Now the emperor became the absolute ruler, the head of Japan, the leader of Japan, and he provided protection against any foreign threat. Okay. While the initial political settlement of January 1868 had resulted in distinctly coalition composed of imperial princes, count nobles, daimyo and their agents, the momentum of political change and social and economic reforms carried far beyond the simple act of destroying the shogunate. So despite the it was the change that this period saw from the mid 19th century, from the middle of the 19th century. The change was not just about the destruction of the shogunate or bringing an end to the rule of the shoguns and reinstating the powers of the emperor of Japan, but with that it brought out various changes in economy and the polity. Okay. Now, the main aim of the emperor in Japan was to strengthen the country, okay, and also to protect it from the threat of the foreigners, from the threat or danger that came from outside, okay. So it adopted, the government now, the emperor now adopted the slogan called Fukoku Kyohei. Now this meant strength and strengthening the armed forces of Japan. Okay, so basically preparing to strengthen and make the armed forces of Japan stronger to prevent and to fight against any threat or danger from outside. All right. Now, as these changes had begun to take place, there was a great demand for constitution of Japan, for the establishment of constitution. Okay, so for the formation or foundation of constitution, that assignment was commissioned by the emperor to a group of men. Okay. Now, this group of men did not come from a representative assembly. These were selected by the emperor. Okay, so the work of constitution or the constitution, its formation, the draft, okay, was completed in 1889. And it was granted, the constitution was granted by the emperor and it was officially proclaimed. Alright, and there were many chief provisions provided by this new constitution of Japan. So now we'll look at the provisions of the constitution. What did the constitution say? What would the government of Japan be like? Alright. Now the constitution emphasized on the institution of the emperor. Okay, what did it say about the emperor? Now the emperor was to be the source of all authority and was combined in himself all sovereignty. So now the emperor was in charge of everything in Japan. Okay, so it had all authority to govern and rule and control over Japan. Now, the emperor would sanction laws and order execution of those laws. Okay, so the government not only was in control of Japan and its people, but it could also make laws, it could also execute those laws. Okay, he could issue ordinances which had the force of law. He could issue new laws and implement it. Okay, he was not only the lawmaker, but he was also head of the executive branch of the government. Okay, he was also head of that branch who made sure that the laws were implemented and laws were followed. Okay, he was also supreme commander of the army as well as the navy. So, when required, he declared war and also made peace and concluded treaties. Okay? So he had an absolute power over Japan, its activities, its military system, its administration, its economy, all of it. All right? He had all the authority now. But in many respects, he reigned but did not rule. His functions were executed by his ministers who were responsible to him. But in many areas, he did not exercise the kind of authority that we are just learning about. He had elected ministers who would actually execute all these powers on behalf of him. They were responsible for him, responsible to him. Okay, so what it tells is that the emperor reigned. The emperor was the head or the ruler or the emperor of Japan, but it did not rule. It had ministers. It had its close circle of officials who executed all its laws, all its rules, all the functions, administrative duties, etc. Okay. The legislature, of the lawmaking department of Japan was called Diet. Okay. Now, Diet was consisted of two chambers. One was the House of Peers, and the other the House of the Representatives. This Diet was very powerful. Okay. This diet was very powerful. No law which was introduced by or which would be formulated by the emperor could not be passed. No new taxes could not be imposed without actually having gone through these houses or the diet and without the consent of the diet. All right, that is why the diet was a very important and crucial part of the government. Okay, now this diet was responsible for approving the annual budget for the whole country. Okay. Now, apart from the diet, there was also a privy council. Now, this privy council was a distinct body of officials who were appointed by the emperor himself. Now, this privy council and the members of this council gave personal advice to the emperor. So, the emperor worked, or the emperor did his duties, the emperor acted according to the advices provided to him by the Privy Council. All right. Now, the Privy Council was made up of the members came from distinguished families. The members were distinguished and very reputed statesmen or Japanese were very reputed members or very reputed people of Japan. All right. Now, Latourette, okay, one of the scholars, he has pointed out that the Constitution of Japan was the first to be granted by a monarch of East Asia. So the Constitution which was set up in Japan by Japan was the first of those constitutions to be granted by a king in East Asia. Okay, with all its conservatism. All right, it had conservative ideals, it had conservative principles, yet it marked the entry of the liberal democratic theories of the West into the Far East. Okay, although the Japanese Constitution bore elements or some aspects of conservative notions or conservative ideas, yet the fact that a constitution was formed itself marks that there was an entry. Okay, there was an entry of liberal democratic theories of the West, which were present in the West, into the Far East, into the government or politics or polity of the Far East. Okay, so the constitution of Japan was elastic. It was liberal. Okay, it was a far cry from feudalism of 1860 to the constitutional monarchy of 1890. So it marked the abandonment of feudalism and the embracing attitude of constitutional monarchy. Okay. So now let us look at the Meiji period. So we learned that one of the important emperors of Japan who brought out a revolution to modernize Japan. That emperor was Meiji. Okay, so we'll look at his period, the period of his rule, and we'll also see what kind of changes did he bring to modernize Japan. All right. Now, the Meiji government immediately after coming to power started a large number of economic reforms in the country. Okay, he started to just right away begin with economic reforms and changes in the economy in the country. Okay, so the regime was one of economic liberalism. Their idea was guided by economic liberalism with freedom of movement, enterprise, and occupation and industry. Okay, so they believed in freedom of movement of people, of goods, okay, and enterprise, occupation, and industry. All this should be liberal. All this should be free to move around for business, for trade, for production, etc. Okay, the government pledged itself the national affairs will be conducted and carried on for the benefit of the nation and the rulers. So the Meiji government made a promise that the national affairs, whatever affairs that the government conducts, that would be carried out in such a manner and carried out only for the benefit of the nation, the whole nation, the country along with its people as well as the rulers. Alright. Now what happened? Japan was thrown open to the outside world. Okay. And it not only opened the doors of Japan for allowing the foreigners and outsiders to enter into Japan, but it also allowed free trade. Okay, and also it began establishment of contact between Japan and the rest of the world. Okay, between Japan and various other countries in the world. All right. So now we'll look at some of the important economic reforms which the Meiji government undertook. Alright, so the first one is abolition of feudalism. Now one of the main achievements of Meiji government or the Meiji rule is the abolition of feudalism or feudal system in Japan. Okay, in 1869, the chief of the four powerful clans, okay, the four powerful clans were Satsuma, Chosu, Haizen, and Tosa. So the chief of these four powerful clans, the head of these four powerful clans, it surrendered its position of the position of leader as territorial magnets and as the symbols of that offer to the emperor the register of their land and the people. So in 1869, the powerful clans, the head of the powerful clans, the four powerful clans who were basically landlords, who were feudal lords in Japan, so they gave up their position of power and handed over the register of their land and the people to the emperor. Okay. Now, as they did that, other feudal lords and other chief daimos, okay, also surrendered similar registers, similar properties, land, to the emperor, okay, and they also surrendered their feudal rights, their possessions, all right, and as they did, other nobles, other landlords also followed, all right. So as you can see, all the chief landlords, feudal lords, gave up their position of power and gave up their feudal rights and possession. Then in August 1871, feudalism was formally abolished by an imperial decree. So in 1871, feudalism was finally abolished by the emperor. Okay, so the clans, the different clans of the feudal lords, they were disbanded. Their land, okay, the fiefs, the land under their control, under their rule, they were abolished and they were reorganized into prefectures, into different provinces on French pattern. Okay, now they were no longer under a single landlord or feudal lord. Now these feudal lords and rich landlords, okay, because they gave up their position, because they gave up their feudal rights and their possessions, they were rewarded with titles, with new titles of nobility. Now, these titles were borrowed by the Japanese emperor from Europe. Okay, so these titles which the Japanese emperor borrowed from Europe, they were used to provide new titles to the nobility, to the nobles, to the ex-feudal lords. Okay. And these ex-feudal lords were also given high offices. Okay, they were given positions in the administration with high salaries under the new government, under the new centralized government. Now, all the peasants, the farmers, the land laborers who worked under the feudal lords in their land, in their estate, they were now free. They were now freed. Okay, and they were made owners of the land that they tilled, that they worked on, and they became immediate subjects not of the feudal lords anymore, but of the emperor. Okay, they were no longer under any person, but the emperor. Okay. Now, scholars like Clyde and Beers, they have pointed out that in this new society, which was reorganized, in this new society established by in this new society introduced by the Meiji emperor, the peasants were free to choose their own fate. Okay, what they wanted to do, how they wanted to live, or how they wanted to die, or where to remain. Okay, where to remain, whether to remain on land or whether to sell that land and go to the city. So that means, that shows that the peasants, the land laborers, were free to do whatever they wished. Okay. Thus, Meiji government by abolishing the feudalism, the feudal system, it gave way to a modern Japanese agriculture with its unique tenant-landlord relationships. There was no longer any feudal relationships existing in the Japanese society. Okay. Now, next we'll look at the industrial development. Now, the advent of the West, now with the entry of the West, or with the entry of countries from the West, Europe, okay, or further the Americas, the Industrial Revolution in Japan began. Okay, the Meiji leaders foresaw that Japan required a modern economy to supply the needs of the new military forces and compete with foreign products at home and abroad. The Meiji rulers were aware that Japan's economy needed to be modernized. They needed new supplies. They needed new resources to to organize or to establish new military forces, and also to compete with foreign goods and products both at home as well as abroad. Okay, so for that they needed to open themselves to the West. Okay, so this was realized by the Meiji leaders or Meiji rulers. The Japanese developed their mines, they built factories, they built railways, docks, harbors where ships, where boats were built. Okay, they established cotton and silk mills, paper mills, chemical works and factories for producing glass and cement. Okay, so all kinds of materials that were required for the development or for the progress of cities and the country, they established all the factories, all those production of those products was already started. Okay, once these enterprises were founded, now once all these factories and the production of goods, okay, once they were founded, the government generally sold them to various favored private interests at extremely low prices. Now these products were sold to private favored, those which the government liked or favored, to those private enterprises or private companies at extremely low prices. Okay, in this way a few wealthy families in Japan emerged, and they were Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo and Yauda families, and collectively these four families were known as Zaibatsu. Now because they emerged as the most wealthy families in Japan, they gained power and stronghold on the national economy. Okay, that persisted, that continued, their power and position continued to exist even to the present time. Okay, now in order to control the flow of foreign capital into the country, okay, the exchange of goods, the exchange of products between Japan and other countries, in order to control this, the industrial production was so designed that it would be capable of competing effectively with foreign goods. Now the production of products and goods in Japan and how it was allowing entry of the products coming from outside, coming from the West, it was done in such a way that it was controlled and regulated in such a way that the Japanese goods could compete with the goods arriving from the West. Okay, they did not just open Japan for the Western goods to arrive in a Japanese market and for people to buy those foreign goods. Japan made sure that the goods and products that they were producing, that their factories and industries were manufacturing, they were of such good quality that they could compete with the foreign goods. Okay. According to Latourette, the Japanese government, true to its intense nationalism, was averse to borrow more from abroad than seemed essential, for loans from the foreigners might be followed by the control over the industries and could jeopardize the jealously cherished national autonomy. So this kind of measures to control the regulation of foreign goods and products into Japan was done so that the foreign powers, okay, the foreign powers who were entering into Japan did not exercise or did not have a more leverage or more power to exercise an influence over Japan. Okay, because the Meiji rulers, they already understood, they had already realized that if they allow their products, if they allow their goods to be of lesser quality than the foreign goods, okay, if they allow themselves to borrow money from the foreign or from Western countries, then that would give a sense of pride to the Western countries, and that would allow the Western countries to have control over the industries, over the economy of Japan. So this, the Japanese rulers, the Meiji rulers, did not want, and they were aware of this. Because of this, from the very beginning, as they brought out economic policies for the development of the economy, they were very careful for not allowing the foreign goods and products to compete over or to win over the Japanese products and goods. All right. Now let us see what was happening with currency and the banking services. Now with the growth of Japanese commerce and industry, there was also the growth of a currency and banking system in Japan. Okay. Now the old feudal character of the Japanese currency was now abandoned. The old system of Japanese currency was abandoned, and the currency system now was completely reorganized to bring out uniformity among the people in Japan. Okay. Now paper currency and the decimal system were introduced, and this paper currency and decimal system was introduced on the basis of the ones which was used in America. So on the American model, they introduced paper currency and decimal system in Japan. The establishment of Bank of Japan resulted in the centralization of the banking system. Okay, with the introduction of Bank of Japan, the banking system now became centralized. Okay, the Bank of Japan was the only bank who could authorize to issue currency notes. Okay, no other could do it. Alright, so the emperor allowed only the Bank of Japan to issue currency. Now this was followed by the establishment of the Yokohama Specie Bank, which mainly dealt with foreign exchange businesses. Alright, but these were all controlled by the emperor. They were centralized. Okay. The growth of the banking system promoted the Japanese trade and commerce, and it also led to the establishment of stock changes and chambers of commerce in Japan, with the increasing growth and development of the Japanese trade and commerce. Okay. Now, next, let us look at the development of transportation and communication. Now, with the development of trade and industry and commerce, another sector which developed was the means of communication and transport. Okay, in 1872, the first government-owned railway line was constructed between Tokyo and Yokohama, and there were private companies, and they were given assistance by the government or emperor to build other railways connecting other parts of the country. Later, these private companies building railways, they were nationalized. They were brought under the emperor, the government. Okay. Telephone system was also introduced in 1877. The government gave assistance, provided support and aid to the shipbuilding industry as well. Okay. Hyogo, in Kobe, Nagasaki and Yokosuka, they became important centers of shipbuilding. Okay. Now next, let us look at the industrial workers, the laborers. Alright. Now with the growth of industries, with the growth of factories, the number of people who worked in these factories, they also increased drastically. Okay, so they were about 7 lakhs in 1870, and that rose to 4 million in 1913. So you can see the massive increase in the number of people working in industries. Now most of the workers worked in units employing less than 5 persons and using neither machinery nor electric power. So most of the people who worked in the industries, they worked in such industries which employed less than 5 persons. Okay, more than half of the workers, they were employed in modern factories, and they were women. Okay, so most of the people who worked in modern factories, more than half of them were women, which means large number of women, and women workers were in majority in modern factories. Okay. Because of so many workers employed in industries, there was the first modern strike. Okay, modern strike which was organized by the women in 1886. So you can see how the workers were deeply engaged with the industrial sector. In 1900, the number of male workers began to gradually increase. Okay, earlier the women workers were in majority, but after 1900, after the beginning of 20th century, the male workers increased. It was only in the 1930s that the number of the male workers began to outnumber women. So from the 1930s, the number of male workers increased so much that now they became majority, okay, more than women. Now, apart from this, large factories which employed more than 100 workers also began to be set up. In 1909, the number of such factories which employed more than 100 workers was only 1,000. But by 1920, in just about a decade or 10 years, that number increased to 2,000. So it doubled. By the 1930s, their number rose to 4,000, double that. Okay. But the number of factories employing less than 5 employees was over 50,000. So the largest number of factories that existed or that was set up in Japan were those factories which employed less than 5 persons. Okay. This helped in sustaining the families in Japan. Now the Japanese family could sustain themselves. Okay, just in the way how the emperor was sustaining the entire nation. So the idea of emperor as the head of the family. So the nation Japan was a family and the emperor, the ruler, was the head of the family. So this kind of idea was also spread to the Japanese families where the women were the head of the family. They worked in the factories and they were looked after their family members at home. Okay, so the same kind of idea was applied for sustenance of people. Now, of course, this rapid growth and development of industry led to the exploitation of natural resources like land, forests, rivers, ocean, etc. Okay, so this led to environmental destruction. Okay, over a period of time. Now, the first agitation, first protest against the industrial pollution was started by a person called Tanaka Sozo. Okay, and he was elected as the first House of Representatives. Remember, we learned about the diet, how there were two houses, House of Peers and House of Representatives. Tanaka Sozo, who protested, who agitated against the industrial pollution caused by the rapid growth and development of industries and factories in Japan, he was also elected as the first house, a member of the first House of Representatives. Okay. In 1897, Tanaka started the program of mass protest with 800 villages forcing the government to take action against the pollution caused by the industries and industrial development. Now, one of the things which we have to remember is that although Japan was rapidly moving towards industrial development, okay, industrialization, and it was bringing growth in the economy of the country, but it did not help everybody, okay? It did not help the common people. Alright, so let us see how it did not help the common people. One of the scholars, he has pointed out that industrialization in Japan from the beginning was guided towards the strengthening and achieving greater glory of the state and not for the benefit of the individual. From the very beginning, industrialization, the measures taken by the Meiji government and the Meiji rulers for the improvement of the economy and development of industrialization was targeted for the development and growth and the benefit of the nation. But it never focused on the development of each individual citizen of that country, of that nation. Okay, so it did not focus on the benefit of the individual. All right. While a few industrial families which combined at the top amassed great wealth, the peasants languished in poverty. So this industrialization, it brought great wealth and huge profit to a few number of families. Okay, like the ones we saw, the four rich families who benefited from this industrial revolution in Japan, right? So there were families who grew wealthier, who became economically so strong and powerful. The peasants, they were pushed to poverty and miseries. Okay. Now, the population of the country increased from 30 million in 1850 to 70 million in 1950. But the goods that were produced, okay, the goods that were exported, but the goods that were produced by the country, by Japan, those goods were not meant for the home market. They were meant only for export. Okay, so with the number of people rising, number of population rising, more food was required to feed the population. But the food that was produced by, or the products that was produced by Japan, instead of using it to provide, to supply it to the individuals and also see that they were taken proper care of, that was not also provided. Okay, because all the produced goods and other articles, they were sent to the foreign countries, they were sent outside, they were exported. All right, so this also caused misery or added to the miseries of the poor people. The business combinations of Japan were quite different from those of USA at the end of the 19th century. There was no specialized formation in the single market as in the case of the USA. Instead, in Japan, Mitsui and Mitsubishi brought under their control industrial and commercial enterprises engaged in different fields of activity. So, despite the industrial revolution in Japan, what happened was the poorer sections of the Japanese society were pushed to more poverty and misery. But the rich, the wealthy family who was benefiting, wealthy families who were benefiting from this industrialization, they gained control and they gained power over the industrial and commercial enterprises in Japan. Okay, and these enterprises were engaged in different fields of commercial activities. Okay. Now let us look at the economic growth of Japan between 1904 to 1920. Now in 1904-1905, an important event took place, and that was the Russo-Japanese War. Japan fought with Russia. Okay, so the war between Russia and Japan is called Russo-Japanese War, and this was fought between 1904 and 1905. Now, this war had also produced good economic results for Japan. This war proved good for the economy of Japan. Okay, the industrial production was geared up during the war. So, as Japan was fighting the war, the industrial production increased. Okay, they had to supply equipments, they had to make or produce or manufacture tools, all right, to provide to the soldiers to fight. So as a result of that, the industrial production increased during the war. Now, the industrial production and the industries grew to such an extent in Japan that now the foreign countries began to offer capital resources to Japan. Now Japan began to attract foreign capital, foreign investors, the foreigners, okay, foreign countries. Now, foreign capital, okay, the foreigners now began to invest in the Japanese industries like metal, electrical, rubber, shipbuilding, etc. Okay, so this added to the economic growth, to the industrial production and development in Japan. Okay. Now, as the industrial production increased, the Japanese foreign trade also started to increase in volume. Okay, the trade also accelerated. It also increased. Now, the trade increased mainly with Asiatic and North American countries. So the trade that was taking place, this trade happened between the Asian countries and also the North American countries. Okay, China took 90% of the Japanese cotton textiles. 90% of the cotton textiles that were manufactured, that was taken by China. Okay, and the United States of America took the whole of silk produced by Japan. Okay, so you see, most of the most of the manufactured products, they were absorbed by China and the United States of America. So because of how good quality of products were manufactured by Japanese industries and factories, because of the superior qualities of their goods, Japan now became a serious competitor in the international market because the quality of their product and articles was very good in the international market. It could compete with the products of, say, for example, United States of America or China. All right. Another event in history which caused the economic development of Japan was again the First World War. Another war. Okay. Now, First World War took place between 1914 to 1918. Now, this also helped, just like the Russo-Japanese War, this also helped in stimulating the industrial production in Japan. Now, during the First World War, all the Western countries who were engaged in the war, they were preoccupied, they were busy with the war. They were busy fighting in the war. Okay? So now this gave Japan advantage to engage in the production of war material. Okay? Now, all the countries in the West who were occupied, who were busy with the war, busy fighting in the war. Now, because they were engaged in the war, they were producing only those materials that were required for their fight in the war, for fighting in the war. Say, for example, guns, equipments, the equipments and tools used by the armies, etc. Okay, so now Japan took advantage of this situation, how the Western countries were concentrating in production of war materials only. So now they increased their industrial production of all other products, of all other articles. Okay, and they captured the markets, okay, in countries like India, East Indies, South America and Africa. Okay, and they started to trade and export their articles and goods to these countries. So earlier they only focused, their products were absorbed into China and United States of America. But now, by the First World War, they had entered the markets of India, East Indies, South America, as well as Africa. Okay. Now, the steel and chemical industries also saw remarkable growth during this time. The government helped the newly established industrial sectors by exempting them from paying the business and income taxes. Now, the government also helped in pushing and encouraging the development of the industries during this period. And how the government did that? It exempted the industries, it exempted the factories. They would not now require, they were not They were not required to pay any kind of business or income taxes to the government. So as a result of this, the industries could focus in manufacturing, in producing more goods. Okay. Thus, by the end of the First World War, by the end of this war, Japan emerged as an industrial nation in the world, as one of the most industrialized nation in the world. Okay. Now, this growth of economy and industrialization, which we already know had emerged to such an extent, such an increased, such a high peak by the end of the First World War, this came to an end in 1920. Okay, and there were various reasons for this. In the first place, there was revival and reappearance of competition by Western countries after the end of the war. So first cause was that the competition, which during the First World War had lessened or had decreased, this came or resurfaced after the First World War. Okay, so the Japanese goods and Japan had to compete with other countries and their products. All right, so this caused abrupt end to their industrial heights, okay, commercial heights. Second cause was the slump or economic depression of 1920. Okay, so this economic depression of 1920 caused and affected the home industries, the industries in Japan, affected or it caused them to decline. Okay. Third cause was the devastating earthquake that took place in the year of 1923. Now this also shook the economy of Japan. Fourth, in 1927, there was a failure of banks in the country, and this further deteriorated or further led to the decline of the economy of Japan. Okay, and lastly, another important cause for the decline or for the end of this economic heights of Japan, which it experienced by the end of the First World War, was the worldwide economic depression of 1929 to 1932. Okay, so this economic depression of 1929 to 32 had affected the economy of the entire world, and Japan could not escape. Okay, so this led to the setback of the economic growth and development of Japan in 1920. Okay. Now, of course, the Japanese government made efforts to restore the growth and development of industries after the setback. Okay, it introduced economic and financial reforms such as restoration of gold standard and the value of yen to its pre-war parity. It tried to bring Japan to its pre-war, the kind of economic stability and heights that it had reached before the war. Okay, it tried very hard. Secondly, the Japanese government set up the Industrial Rationalization Bureau in 1930. Now, the aim and objective of this bureau was to overtake the industrial system by affecting rationalization of the industry. So, this was also done in an effort to restore the development of industries in Japan. In the years that followed 1920, Japan was able to make much progress in the field of industries, commerce and trade. Okay. Japan's economy was restored to normalcy. It could bounce back again by 1936. Okay. So it suffered in the 20s, but its economy bounced back in 1936. The index of industrial production, which stood at 90, so its industrial production index stood at 90 in 1931, it increased to 149 by 1939. So you can see how Japan had improved economically. Okay. Advance of loans to industries and soothing financial policy introduced by the government, it led to the revival of Japan's industrial production, increase in exports, and full employment conditions of the people. Okay, so the government took measures, and these measures were to help the enterprises by providing financial policies, by providing them loans. Okay, so these measures helped in the increased production of industries, increase in exports, etc. All right. So this ultimately helped Japan to bounce back and develop. Bounce back and increase its economy and industrial increase its economic development by 1936.